When you're planning an RPG campaign, it's very important to find a system that fits the genre you want to run. You don't want to use Call of Cthulhu to run the Avengers unless you want the first session to end with half the PCs dying and the others running away and screaming something about tentacles. So to avoid that issue, maybe you just want to say, fuck it, I want a system that can run anything. And you're kind of in luck, because there are definitely systems that can run everything from epic fantasy to grimdark sci-fi to goofy comedy, or any combination of existing genres. And they can be incredibly useful if you have that one unique campaign idea that wouldn't fit in a system with a more defined setting. That said, each of these systems has its own mechanical quirks that'll influence gameplay, and I thought I'd dive into 3 of the most popular generic systems to help decide which one might be right for you. So the first system I want to talk about is Savage Worlds, which I think is a really nice, well-rounded system that's a good branching point for a lot of D&D players. Broadly speaking, it aims to capture a sort of pulp adventure style, but that covers a lot of ground, from Indiana Jones to Mad Max to Van Helsing. Character creation is pretty open, with a ton of options even in the core book, but the characters are built from the same basic template, so new players might not feel completely lost when they sit down to make a character. Combat is also really fun and decently nuanced, with rules for things like called shots and multi-attacks that are generally viable whenever it makes sense to use them. Just like in D&D, combat is mostly designed to be played with miniatures on a battle grid, but you can easily do theater of the mind as well. Another positive of Savage Worlds is that there's a ton of expansion content that's really useful for fleshing out the wide open potential of the system. Some of them are straight up setting books, from Cyberpunk to Supernatural Wild West to Pathfinder, in case you wanted to play a game set in Galarian without needing to consult a 50-item flowchart whenever you grab someone. Others are more generic sourcebooks for certain broad genres, giving you plenty of character options and enemies for sci-fi or fantasy or superheroes. With most generic systems, you're pretty much on your own when it comes to things like monster stat blocks, but that's not the case here. And if you know you'll be on a time crunch when preparing story beats and encounters, that can really help. The next system I wanted to talk about is Fate. This one is a lot lighter than Savage Worlds, and especially the last game on this list. And it's probably best suited to very character-driven stories where the players aren't afraid to help shape the narrative. There are actually 3 different versions of this game, but I think Fate Core is easily the best, as it has just enough complexity to allow for a mechanical variety while still being fairly minimalist. Just like in Savage Worlds, character creation is based on a loose template where each player chooses a given number of skills, features, and drawbacks, but it requires way more filling in the blanks for both the GM and the players. On the GM side, you're expected to write up your own skill list based on the challenges the heroes will face, although the book does give you plenty of suggestions. On the player's side, you're expected to come up with your own aspects, which are basically personality or backstory traits that are expected to influence the narrative. You can spend a fate point to have an aspect benefit you, while you can earn a fate point whenever an aspect messes things up. You can also spend a fate point to influence events of the larger story, like maybe declaring that the corrupt sheriff is actually the mysterious figure who killed your PC's father. A lot of other games have something like this as an optional rule, including Savage Worlds and even D&D, but Fate really leans into it. Because of this abstract control given to the players, along with the game's general simplicity, you really shouldn't be using it for anything that resembles a tactical murder hobo campaign. But if you want to run a narrative-driven campaign where the mechanics will never get in the way of your story, especially if your players aren't shy about a little improv, it might just be the game for you. And finally, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have GURPS. Well, GURPS is similar to Fate in exactly one way. Both are very customizable, although GURPS isn't quite as upfront about it. Otherwise, GURPS is way less focused on abstract storytelling and way more focused on creating an accurate physical simulation of the game world. If realism is what you're looking for, I have yet to find a system that does it better than this. And by realism, I don't mean your game can't have any wizards or aliens. I just mean that beyond those specific deviations from reality, your game will feel a lot more like a gritty crime thriller than a campy action romp. Characters will have a bad time trying to use skills that they aren't trained in, and combat is nasty, brutish, and short, with each round taking only a second of game time. From what I can tell, the general opinion toward GURPS is that it's overly complex and requires way too much math to get anything done. And that might be true if you don't like anything crunchier than PBTA, but otherwise, I think it runs pretty smoothly once you're past character creation, especially once you remember that you can ignore any rule that seems too cumbersome. But during character creation, well, it can get a little overwhelming. Unlike Fate and Savage Worlds, which at least use a basic template for each character, GURPS character creation is 100% point buy, where you just choose a point limit and let your players go wild with whatever stats, skills, and abilities they want. And they can also gain extra points by buying disadvantages. According to the rulebook, it's totally valid to give your character epilepsy, insomnia, alcoholism, bad temper, selfishness, selflessness, a missing arm, and no sense of humor in exchange for time travel powers. Obviously, that character would be totally ridiculous during gameplay, so it's your job as a GM to tell your players which content is allowed and how they should generally allot their points. The book does a pretty good job setting guidelines for players, but what it doesn't do is provide anything substantial on the GM side. The core rulebook has a whopping 3 monster stat blocks and an incredibly nondescript encounter table. That's about it. Now, there is a ton of expansion content for this game, but I have mixed feelings about it. Most of the books that I've seen are just more player options. And with the exception of Magic, which is kinda lackluster in the core book, I just don't think many people will ever need that. With the core book alone, you can already stat up just about any character ever. I could literally make a character sheet for my Roomba if I wanted to. There might be a few source books with things like monsters and encounter concepts, but for the most part, you're gonna be on your own with that stuff. All this being said, I don't think any game matches GURPS in pure scope and pure commitment to physical simulation. So now that we've covered all 3, which game should you play? Well, if you want an abstract and rules light system, you'll want to use Fate, no doubt about it. If you want a more tactical experience, or your players don't feel up to driving the story themselves, I'd say you should generally lean towards Savage Worlds as long as your characters fit under that cinematic action hero umbrella. If your characters are more grounded or esoteric than like James Bond or Han Solo, they might be a little outside the Savage Worlds wheelhouse, and you might want to look into GURPS. Like, a couple years ago, my friend ran a zombie apocalypse campaign in which we literally played ourselves, with our stats being an approximation of our actual capabilities, to really dive into what it would be like to survive the end of the world. And I think that was pretty much the perfect place for GURPS due to its emphasis on realism. But otherwise, I think the easier character creation and GM-centric content of Savage Worlds makes it better for most GMs. But hey, that's just a rough guideline, and if any of these games really piqued your interest, then just give it a go regardless. And these 3 are far from the only generic systems out there, so if there are any others you'd like to shout out, feel free to do so in the comments below. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. If this video does well, or if I feel up to it, I might make more videos comparing related systems like this. For now, I'll catch you all next time.